Today we have a reserve breakdown, okay, for the Starshatter Arsenal. So if you are somebody that is struggling with how in the heck do I decide what I put in reserves, this video is going to be for you. I'm going to go through and explain my thought process and methodologies, if I could talk correctly, about how I decide what is going to go in reserve and what is not going to go in reserve. So if that's something that interests you, stick around. Love for you to hang out, and let's nerd out and let's talk about it, okay? So, Starshatter Arsenal, reserves. First thing that we are going to be going over is, and what I'm thinking about is board control and how I am delivering those units, okay? So, when we are talking about board control, I went ahead and made it a little bit easier. So we have layout 6, GW, we have Crucible Battle Deployment. I went ahead and deployed my Starshatter Arsenal list on the board already. If you're interested in looking at a deployment breakdown of this, there is a video that I posted last week and goes over everything, so I'm not going to go into detail today. We're just talking about reserves, all right? So we are looking at board control in the early game. So when we're talking about board control, mainly I'm talking about the opponent. So, for example, let's say we are playing against more of an elite Space Marine army, okay, as a good example. So usually we're thinking about how many total units does this army have. So let's say, usually like an elite Space Marine army, they have anywhere between like 9 and 12 units, or maybe Grey Knights is another good example. Potentially demons, like a monster mash list, right? They have a lot of these big, durable, elite units that are wanting to stand on objectives, okay? But with those lists, a lot of times, they don't have a lot of strong board control early, okay? So what we mean by that is if they have like a lot of big units, okay, that are spread out, they're moving across the board, okay? Some of them don't have as good movement. And the thing is with those type of armies is that they're not really providing a lot of like really strong early game pressure for the most part. So it allows you to deliver your reserve units a little bit easier against these armies. Okay, so it's easier to get them in better spots to shoot or to get fight or have a rapid ingress, right? So if you were to take orcs, for example, or you were to take GSC, or you were to take, those are two really good examples where they have a lot more units. They're more of like what we call an MSU style, or like many small units. They're going to have a lot of little units that are moving fast that I know are looking to like stage up and be annoying, or stage up here, push up here. And they're going to be establishing a lot of board presence early. Votan is another good example. Tau, potentially, especially with the new Grotmist attachment that they got. Those type of armies that are trying to apply a lot of strong early game pressure is going to be a strong board control. And so when we're talking about our reserves, let's go to our potential reserve units, okay, which is going to be the 6 Locust Brick of Destroyers. We have a unit of 2 Emetics and a unit of 1 Emetics and a unit of Tomb Blades, okay? So let's talk about the Locust Heavy Destroyers first. So against an army that has a very strong board control, our Votan, our Tau, our Orcs, our, again, anything that's like MSU, most likely I'm going to want to put these Scorpec Destroyers on the table, because the reason, or sorry, not Scorpec Destroyers, Locust Destroyers, excuse me. I'm going to want to put these units on the table because, one, they're a very big footprint. So I know it's going to be difficult in the game, especially if my opponent gets first turn, to be able to put this unit anywhere worthwhile, right? Because if I put them, like let's say hypothetically I leave them in reserve, right? And they're bringing up units, they're pressing up here, they're pressing up here, they're pressing up here, right? Now, all of a sudden what happens, they're denying 9 inches away from these lines, right? So what ends up happening is if you leave this unit in reserve because you stick to the game plan, like, oh, I always put these units in reserve, then what happens is they're just going to get pushed back so far that they're not usually going to get good lines on anything, as you can see. Like, then I'm like, oh, best case, I can rapid ingress them here, or I rapid ingress them over here. But, like, that really doesn't get me much. I mean, potentially on a rapid ingress, yes, you could, like, flat 6 advance them and move them there. But a lot of times, like, you want to save your CP potentially for other resources. So a lot of times you might put them back here, like, out of line of sight, that first turn. So they still have a projected threat, and you can get hopefully the most value out of them by swinging them, over this way or over this way and covering, like, these lines, right? So, but let's do, like, the opposite, right? Let's say we're playing against, like, an elite Space Marine army, or we're playing against an elite Demons army. Maybe we want to actually put these in reserve, because yes, they do have a big footprint, but I know those armies a lot of times aren't going to probably be having, like, a really strong board control in the early game. So I can get these units in very strong spots to start, which is really important to make sure they're going to be able to trade up. And that leads me into my second point, is what does the early game look like? And again, that kind of synergizes with board control and how we're going to deliver these units. So thinking about your opponent, and okay, if they're a strong board control army, what does the early game look like? Okay, potentially they're probably going to press really hard to start. If they're an elite, not as strong board control army in that early game, they're maybe not going to be pressing as hard up, and it's going to be easier to deliver these units, right? And then mainly the last point when we're talking about reserves is, how are we going to maximize these units' value, right? We're always trying to make sure that we can deliver these units and connect with things that are going to be the highest amount of damage. So for most games, I usually want this locust brick in reserve, because of the fact that you want to keep your opponent guessing of where they are going to go. So hypothetically, if it is a strong board control army and I know they're going to be pressing, like, I know they're going to have good targets no matter what. But against an elite army, you would more or less want them in reserves, because you want to keep them guessing of, oh, are they going to come out here? Or is he going to ingress them here? Or is he ingress them here? And it allows you to kind of react to your opponent better. Good players always talk about rapid ingress as one of the best, if not the best, stratagem in the game, because of the fact that, one, your opponent has to play around that stratagem, and two, it allows you to dictate where you need your damage on your next turn to really maximize a value for this unit. And so that's one of the biggest things. And with the Emitic Locust Heavy Destroyers as well, again, how are we going to maximize their value? So I'm thinking about the unit of 2, and I'm thinking about the unit of 1. So a lot of times I will keep the unit of 1 on the board, which I talk about, like, in the early game for what does the early game look like? So if I'm playing against World Eaters, or I'm playing against Space Marines, right? They're usually putting up scouts. Or if I'm playing against Blood Angels, they're putting up JPIs, okay? If I'm playing against World Eaters, they're putting up Jackals that first turn, okay? Again, what does that skirmish game look like? What does that early game look like? So by putting this Locust Heavy Destroyer here, I know mentally that my opponent is probably going to put some of those resources out ahead of time. So you have to think about, okay, do I really need to put this unit of 2 Locust Heavy Destroyers out there? Not really, because it's massive overkill on those units. You don't need that much output to kill those units. A lot of times, just the Locust Heavy Destroyer with the Emitic and the Silent King's Indirect is going to clean up those units in the early game. So it's also trying to balance out, okay, by what can I put on the board that I know for sure in the early game is going to be able to clean up some of these skirmish units, and then I can leave my heavy hitters in reserve to really maximize their value. Okay, so again, certain matchups, again, if they have strong board control, going back to the first point, I'm probably going to put both of these units on the board, because they are going to be pressing with a lot of units, Votan, Orcs, GSC, where I'm going to need kind of all of my firepower, like kind of all hands on deck, think of it that way, up front. And I can't maybe afford to have those units in reserve, because I might need that firepower that first turn to kill off some of those screens. Because if hypothetically I put those units in reserve against a strong board control army, they're just going to press that first turn. I'm not going to be able to clear out the screens effectively. And then I'm essentially, you've probably heard the term like getting jailed or like wolf jail or, you know, any type of jail term. That's essentially what it means. They're just pushing stuff in your deployment zone and get you locked in because you can't clear the screens and you can't fall back and shoot. And it's just not good. It's just not good. So generally, again, against strong board control early game, you're going to basically want all hands on deck, probably less stuff in reserve. A lot of times I would just have like a unit of Tomb Blades in reserve. And then against weak board control armies, or, you know, they're not really like pushing hard to start, I'm probably going to have a lot of these units just in reserve because I'm going to need them more towards the mid and late game. Okay. So the last thing we're going to talk about is the utility of these units, and specifically the Tomb Blades. And this is one of the biggest reasons I love Tomb Blades and Starshatter Arsenal. I think they are so strong. One, because they just synergize with all of the strats, which is really good. And then two, they help a little bit in the early game in terms of trying to deny your opponent primary, which is something that Starshatter really struggles with. So with the Tomb Blades, a lot of times you want one unit in reserve. And the reason for that is because it gives you a lot of utility during the game. And the biggest thing is either coming out of reserves to fire and fade, or you can rapid ingress them in and get them to a point on the next turn to deny primary. So throughout the game, what I'm looking for is what is my opponent putting on this objective and this objective as far as OC, okay? Because I know in this layout, this is more or less my natural expansion. You could argue this point down here, but this is really your natural expansion because you have this nice wall here. And so I'm constantly looking at, okay, going into my turn, how much OC are they putting on these objectives? Is it 2? Is it 4? Is it 6? Is it 10? Is there even an option that I can deny and I have to put more assets on there to try to get rid of it, or more resources, okay? So a lot of times in the early game, your opponent isn't committing a lot of resources early to their natural expansion. But if they are, it does give you flexibility, because let's say it's like battle round 2 and maybe the Stalker is still alive. And the nice thing about Stalkers is they're OC4. So what you can do is you can swing this Stalker. Let's say, just hypothetical. Again, these are like very like hypothetical examples, but just for learning. Let's say you have this Stalker on the point, or it's like your turn. The Stalker's like right here. He moved like let's say he's got like 6 OC on there. Okay. You're like, crap, man. The Stalker is only, I'm just going to put a 6 here. The Stalker is only 4 OC. So a lot of times what you can do is either, depending on if they have an Overwatch threat, it gives you the option to either rapid ingress these Tomb Blades in, like behind a wall. Okay. Like behind the wall here, or, you know, somewhere over here, because they have to come in strategic reserve. Or if they don't have an Overwatch threat, you can just drop them in on your turn. And then whatever is on this objective or over here, you can fire at this and then fire and fade and combine these two units to have a total of 10 OC on the objective and then deny their primary. So it's a really strong move. There's a couple battle reports that I posted, recently, that really highlighted the Tomb Blade strength in terms of move blocking, screening, primary denial. There is so much that they do for 75 points in this attachment. I think they are just an auto include, again, because of the utility that they provide in your reserves. So again, wrapping up, really the biggest things you want to think about in reserve, okay? Again, board control. Is it strong board control or is it weak board control in the early game, and how am I delivering these units? The second thing, what does the early game look like, okay? What is your opponent trying to do, okay? Especially if they get first turn. And then 3, what are these units? How are they deploying in a way that I can maximize their value? And looking at the terrain footprint as a whole, and where realistically am I going to be able to deploy these units to make sure that they're going to be able to trade up at the end of the day. Okay, so hopefully you found this helpful. This is like a quick breakdown of the reserves in my Starshatter Arsenal list. Let me know what you thought below. I'd love to do kind of more reserve breakdowns in the future on different lists, or things you'd like to add or things you'd like to see. But if you stuck around to the end, Seriously appreciate you. And until the next one,